Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Mr. Gosler bringing you your lesson for today. Today we're going to be starting on topic 2 of our unit on imperialism. When we left off, we've been discussing kind of the first instances of imperialism in the 1800s in southern Africa and the exploits of the British in that region. Today we are going to continue discussing imperialism as it affects Africa. And as a quick review, I want to remind everybody, yesterday we discussed something called the Berlin Conference. This is where European powers met and started drawing lines on the continent of Africa to claim territories within the continent, all along without ever considering the diverse cultures, political structures, or having any African have any input in how this continent would be divided up amongst European nations. Now, this would lead to conflicts between both European nations and Europeans and Africans. But today, our main focus for our lesson is going to be looking at specifically the ways in which imperialism was practiced in Africa, primarily by the British and the French. And then we are going to take some time to complete a case study on one of these colonies that would be established by the British Empire. So during the 18th and 19th centuries, you would see the imperialist ambitions of Europeans escalate quite rapidly. They felt that since they had finished exploring the continent, that it would now be time for them to truly start conquering the entirety of it, specifically because it benefited their economies to have the resources necessary in order to continue industrialization within their own borders. And the way they would do this would be by flexing their muscle or gaining influence over different indigenous populations in Africa that they would have to deal with when conquering these lands. There are primarily 4 ways in which we categorize the different ways that European nations would implement colonial control over different parts of Africa. We've mostly been talking about colonies. This is where a European nation would go into an African region, claim it as its own, directly govern the colony, usually through some type of a military presence. There were also protectorates as well. A protectorate was similar to a colony. However, the local African leaders were actually allowed to maintain control over the region and their peoples. But this was quite a facade, as they would answer directly to the foreign governors that were placed there, especially when it came to military exploits or dealing with other Africans or other Europeans in their own regions. There was also this kind of idea of Europeans practicing a sphere of influence over certain areas in Africa and as well other parts of the world. This is where you establish maybe like a port city or a town where you would have not necessarily control over the people that lived in that region, but instead you would have the exclusive right over trade and investments in resources and businesses in those regions in Africa. Which is actually quite similar to economic imperialism, a type of imperialism that the United States practiced very thoroughly, and we'll discuss that in a later lesson, which more or less, with economic imperialism, this would allow, in Africa, Europeans to directly control the economy of different regions in Africa without actually having to ever implement direct political control. Again, it's more of a facade in a sense that the peoples in that region, the Africans, would have some kind of power over their own peoples, when in reality, the resources and the money made from those resources would really only be benefiting the Europeans that settled there. So you can kind of break them down like you see here. And there are many, many different ways in which these 4 forms of imperialisms were practiced. But we're going to take a look at one specific example today in just a little bit that is going to go a little bit more into detail in how multiple of these forms of imperialism were practiced. And no matter how you put it, all four of these actually have two other kind of subcategories in which they were practiced as well. These would be methods of management, is what we're going to call them. They were primarily categorized into either indirect or direct control over colonies. Europeans, specifically the British, favored a more indirect approach, while as the French, who controlled large regions of Africa, they were more preferential towards direct control. So with indirect control, a lot of times this would be something along the lines of a protectorate or a sphere of influence or economic imperialism, in that you don't have per se like a military leader having political control over the local African peoples, but you would have some kind of authority over their leaders. So it's almost kind of like a feudal hierarchy. When it comes to the French and their method of direct control, this is where they would have military intervention, where they would place military leaders directly in control over politics and the kind of societal structures of the African different colonies that they established. Again, there are a variety of ways in which this a lot of times affected African peoples later on, but primarily actually colonies that were indirectly controlled, like many of those under the British Empire, often would actually end up establishing their own democratic forms of government after gaining independence from Europeans in the 1900s. But again, the methods of management, really, they're just kind of broken up into whether you have, or you allow the local peoples to have some political control or not. If you allow them to have some, but those political leaders answer to like governors or European leaders abroad, that's indirect. Whereas direct control is where you a lot of times have a foreign official, such as a governor, directly controlling the lives of the African peoples or whoever you've established a colony over. You have direct control over them, and there is no leadership roles in the hands of any local authorities. You can break it down like this as well, but again, it really just depends on, in many cases, what European group was in control. Again, the British primarily practiced indirect, whereas the French practiced primarily direct control. However, again, when it comes to indirect control, a lot of times these groups actually in the long run ended up actually benefiting more than those who faced direct control. This is primarily because a lot of times there wasn't as much violence or uprisings that led to military intervention. A lot of times with indirect control, local people still had some semblance of control over their own peoples. Whereas a lot of times when we talk about direct control, it was a little bit different. A lot of times, this is what a lot of people attribute to nations today that have struggled in surviving in the post-colonial or post-imperialistic world. This is primarily because a lot of times their own local cultures and traditions were pretty much forced to be forgotten. And a lot of times this did lead to quite bitter resentment amongst Europeans and Africans, especially on the side of the Africans, as a lot of times like being forced to give up your tradition or being forced to assimilate is what a lot of people call it, would create a lot of anger. And a lot of times when we talk about direct control, many European nations like France, they would justify practicing this type of control through ideologies like social Darwinism, saying that they were civilizing these people, when in reality, a lot of times after they gained their own independence, the native populations that were originally under direct control by Europeans were left with no to little skills of management of their own affairs, leading to civil wars and ethnic conflicts in the 20th century. So what I would like for you to do is, with a neighbor, I want you to go back over the last few slides, and I want you to discuss this question and make sure that you can explain your ideas thoroughly with your partner. Were there many differences between direct and indirect control when it comes to colonies in Africa? And again, look back, think about that deeply, and then we'll have an answer for you in just a minute or two. So I would say when you look at this question, it really depends on who you ask. I would say that those African peoples that were under the direct control of the French, for example, a lot of times the treatment that they received was very harsh. And in many cases, it ignored or asked those people to pretty much give up their own identity. Whereas in, yes, indirect controlled management colonies, they were allowed to continue to practice their own culture, but in many cases, I would say that they still had some type of ownership of their culture and identity. And it's hard to say, honestly. I would say, in my own opinion, long term, the benefits of being in an indirect colony were much better than direct, as many indirect colony setups. They allowed for locals to understand how to lead their own peoples in the modern world. Whereas a lot of directly controlled colonies would struggle after they gained their independence, primarily because there just wasn't anybody left who truly understood, should I say, how to deal with the global world that came about after the First and Second World Wars, which is something we'll talk about in a later date. So the one case study that we are going to do today is going to focus on a British colony called Nigeria. It's a country today as well. And this is going to be kind of a tricky case in that you will see both direct and indirect control of this colony throughout its history. To start us off, though, I am going to give you a short little history lesson about Nigeria through the following video. Please make sure that you are listening closely. It's going to be going through quite a large chunk of history when it comes to Nigeria, but it does set up the modern state of the nation as we're going to be looking at it when the British arrive. Okay.